other ways. Let's go over to page 27 then. Here we're going to deal with, but not commit, suicide. And much of this material is found in the Summa Theologiae, the Secunda Secundae, that's what the 2.2 stands for, 64.5 body of the article. And of course, what we're really dealing with here is the right to life. We're dealing with what it means to be a living human being and what obligations flow therefrom. Because obligation, remember, is determinative of rights. If you have an obligation to something, you have a corresponding right. So when we talk about the right to life, it is based primarily or priorly upon the obligation to live. And why do we have an obligation to live? What you have on page 27 are several arguments in favor of one's obligation to live. First, and most obviously, is man's basic drive to exist, to be, to live. If you doubt that, of course, try to kill somebody. You will find they don't like it. They will resist it in most every case. The fact that a few people, under various forms of duress or mental incapacity, may opt to try to kill themselves or do kill themselves does not argue against the fact that the basic drive is a drive to live. As St. Thomas says in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, in the early part, he points out that nature always acts so as to attain its end. An agent always acts to attain its end, and fails in a few instances because of some corruption. In other words, nature normally will reach to its goal. It may fail sometimes. So the natural drive of man is to live. The fact that a few people in a few cases choose to kill themselves does not mean that the basic drive is not to live. The overwhelming evidence is that we live and we fight to live, and we seek to live in most all circumstances. And that most often when somebody actually wants to die, it's because they're suffering from some severe clinical depression or because they have all kinds of maladies afflicting them, often which may affect their good judgment about what they would want to do. So it's evident that there's a natural drive to live. Another argument is that the part belongs to and exists for the whole. Man does not live unto himself. No man is an island. We are part of society. So that if we kill ourselves, we are killing a part of something to which we belong. The person is not merely a useful good, but a worthy good, an end in himself. So it's not simply that we can be thrown away or can throw ourselves away like wood into fire. We are a value unto our own end. But the more dominating principle is the third one, and that is that we do not create ourselves. Many people say, well, it's my body, my life, I have the right to do with it what I want. And of course, the simple fact is, no, it isn't. We are creatures. We are created by God. Every one of us, in coming into existence, is the object of a decision, you might say, of God himself as to whether we would be or not. Of all the countless billions of rational souls that could have been brought into existence, we are here and the rest are not. For every one of us that exists, there's countless billions that could have existed but don't exist. If you just consider in the birth process itself how many conceptions do not occur, how many instances of attempted conception do not take place, the number of sperm that are trying to reach that ovum that don't make it. And so that every one of us is here, of course, from an atheistic standpoint, we'd say by chance, but from a theistic standpoint, as an object of divine providence. We are here because God wills us to be here as this individual person. But this individual person is given a nature that is ordered to a last end that transcends this earthly life, because our spiritual life, our soul, is ordered ultimately to the attainment of the happiness of permanent union with God by knowledge and by love. That's the way that we're made. That's the purpose, the end of our life. And as we've seen at the beginning of this course, the purpose of this life in this world is to prepare us for that afterlife. And of course, the point is, you can't get prepared if you don't live it. And since it is the means that is given to those of us who have a chance at a full life, not everybody does, but since that's the means that we have to perfect ourselves, we have an obligation to do so. And we can't perfect our virtues, for example, if we don't live in order to do them. And therefore we have a strict obligation to live and to live well and to perfect ourselves as much as we can, as long as we can. That is the obligation to live, which begets the corresponding right to live, that no one has the right to interfere with an innocent human being seeking to fulfill his destiny before God by living this life to the fullest. And that is the fundamental reason why homicide is such a terrible act, whether it be the homicide of others or the homicide of ourselves, which is suicide. For us to directly shorten our life is to deny to God his intention in creating us. It isn't as though we completely own our lives or own our bodies. We are, as you know, stewards of our lives. These are possessions. Our very being is a possession given to us as a caretaker, not as one of complete ownership and dominion. Complete ownership and dominion only belongs to the Creator, not to the creature. I realize that's not a popular thing to tell people today, because we live in an age of complete autonomy and personal fulfillment and absolute assertion of freedom, not only to live one's own life as we please, but even to kill an unborn child if we feel that that turns out to be an inconvenience to ourselves. So the assertion of the personal autonomy even goes to the point of denying the right to life to someone else. We have stewardship or self-governance. Our freedom is a freedom to govern ourselves. But we can't just make up the rules, because we are created. We have a nature. The nature is the blueprint of how we are to live. And we didn't create the blueprint, so it isn't up to us to determine all the choices in every direction we want to go, even if it violates that blueprint. The right to life, if you ever think about it, people talk today about a right to die. How can you have two contradictory rights? If I have a right to live, it's because I have an obligation to live. And if I have an obligation to live, I can't possibly have a right to not fulfill that obligation. It's contradictory. You may have a right to allow yourself to die in certain circumstances, but you have no right to make yourself die. The right to live and the right to die in that sense would be to contradict each other. And so if we have a right to live, we can't have a corresponding right to kill ourselves, because that's what people mean when they say have a right to die. You don't need to have a right to die. We're all going to do it all by ourselves, real easily. It'll come even when we don't want it. You don't have to go seeking it. God will provide when the time is up. And of course, one of the things that we realize today, perhaps to an extent we once didn't, is that most of the people that commit suicide are mentally deranged. At least we would hope this to be the case. It isn't always the case, but it is very frequently the case. And that's why at one time people that took their own lives were not allowed to be buried in hallowed ground. And that's another example of an instance in which the church came to realize a fact about psychiatry that was not initially known. And so today it is very possible to be buried in hallowed ground, provided you don't leave a note saying, I've been planning this for 5 years. And of course, it's a matter of, they have to make a prudential judgment, a moral judgment as to what the case is. Clearly, this doesn't apply to the Nazi officers who were running around during World War II carrying suicide pills in their teeth, because that's a predisposition, a plan that was had. And unfortunately, more and more today, because of the growing acceptance of euthanasia, a lot of people are saying, well, don't worry about the old folks. They've got all that they need stocked up in their medicine cabinet to take care of them when the time comes. In fact, I was just corresponding with somebody by email a couple nights ago who was telling me precisely that things were going so badly in the world that he expected that he and his wife were well prepared. They've got, what they need to take care of themselves when the time comes. And of course, a lot of people have this disposition. I'm not going to suffer when I die. When the time comes, I'll just, I'll take care of it myself. But that's, of course, part of the contemporary mentality that has been developed. The idea that my life is completely my own. I'm responsible to no one but myself. Complete autonomy, independent even of God as creator. Okay, any questions up to that point? Curses, comments? No? Okay, well, let's proceed further then. As it says here, you can't order a man to certain or certainly probable death. You can order somebody to risk death. And of course that would entail things like the military, where the obligation of everybody to defend the nation that is under an unjust attack entails that those who are conscripted for this purpose must obey orders, even though, yes, it is possible to get hurt when you are in the military, isn't it? It's possible to get killed. That goes with the territory, and we may have an obligation to do that. But you can't, at the same time, military commanders can't order men into what would be certain death. That's why they always ask for volunteers. They always say, those who wish to volunteer, step forward. And of course, everybody who's smart takes one step backward. Moreover, to risk your life in order to save that of another is not suicide. This is an application of double effect, right? So it's perfectly licit to, especially the fulfillment of your duty, if you're a policeman or fireman or in the military, yes, you may risk your life trying to save other people. Example here, though, you can't go over the falls in a barrel. In other words, you don't have the right to take an unwarranted risk. Now, sometimes people will say, well, how about these people in circuses? They're taking a risk going up, on these high wires and so forth. The balance there is that a matter of competence. So some people, what most people would view as being dangerous may not be that dangerous for them. And you might say, well, they shouldn't engage in an occupation of that sort. Well, the difficulty with that is we have a lot of occupations that entail risk, don't we? An electric lineman, that entails a certain degree of risk. I think I may have mentioned to you before the tombstone down in Mexico of some poor young man that had written on it, he was a good father, he was a wonderful husband, he was a very poor electrician. So, I mean, There's always risk in everything that we do, even when you cross the street. So it's a matter of prudential judgment as to what occupation you may engage in. And again, it may be that economic hardship forces you to take a job that would be more risky. Surely, I'm sure that a lot of coal miners would prefer to do something different than they're doing. And yet, unfortunately, many people are in this kind of position and have to take the risk that is attendant to their economic circumstance. Life is not perfect. And in trying to lead an ethical life, we always are, constrained with all these difficult choices as to, is this right or that right, and what are my obligations? And that, of course, is what we're trying to sort out here in some of the general principles of ethics. This brings us to the further point of, what about medical treatment? Are we obliged to seek medical treatment? Well, generally speaking, for the same reason you're obliged not to starve yourself to death. You're obliged to try to obtain food and eat it to stay alive. You're obliged to drink water or whatever you need in order not to die of thirst. And because those are simply ordinary means of staying alive. And given that we have the means of medical treatment today that are very successful and in many cases relatively easy, we have an obligation to seek medical treatment as it is available to us under ordinary circumstances. Of course, that gets into the question of what do we mean by ordinary means as opposed to extraordinary means. Extraordinary means, generally speaking, would be something that you would view as particularly horrific or painful, or perhaps require the expenditure of funds that you would like to save to provide for your loved ones who are still living. It would be something that would be an unduly risky type of surgery, let's say, or an experimental drug that might have very hideous side effects and very great lack of certainty as to whether it's going to work. So the obligation to use ordinary means would mean those things that one routinely and ordinarily expect you could afford. It would not be unduly painful or cause undue stress to the patient and so forth. Again, that's a matter of common sense, it's a matter of prudence, and it's also a matter of context. Because what was something extraordinary 100 years ago, say even a blood transfusion, when they initially did them, they didn't know about cross-matching and so forth, and you just put the blood from somebody else into your veins, and good luck. It didn't always turn out well, and it was pretty bad. Well, today, if you need a transfusion to stay alive, that's really an ordinary means. It also makes a difference as to where you are. Something that would be an extraordinary operation somewhere in the outback of the Arctic might be routine in a New York City major hospital. Or in the context in reference to the individual, CPR is a standard thing to do with somebody if they're young and reasonably healthy. But if you've got somebody who's 90 years old, you're not going to be pumping up and down on their chest, are you? Because you'll break all the bones in their body. So that again, but then at what point do you make that decision? Where do you cross the line? That's prudence. That's prudence, based for medical personnel, based on experience. So they have guidelines, you see. And always we're making these decisions between what is ordinary and what is extraordinary. The general principle from the standpoint of natural law is you must use ordinary means. You are not obliged to use extraordinary means. You're free to use extraordinary means if you want to. You're just not strictly obliged to. But when it comes to the application of what is extraordinary or ordinary, that's something that good people might differ about. looking at the same situation, somebody might say, well, to me that's extraordinary, and someone else would say, no, that's ordinary. That's all right. What are we obliged to do in reference to somebody who's dying? Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of these, and the general principle is this. First of all, obviously, you can't kill somebody. You can't directly take an innocent human life. If they are dying, you cannot, as they say, put them out of their misery. You know, today we think of this euthanasia mentality as being something new, as something that has become really more pervasive in the last 10 or 20 years. We know that it dates back, of course, easily to the time of the 1930s and 40s and the outrageous behavior of people like Hitler. But I've often thought we take this as being something that's kind of new. But have you ever seen the old westerns where the stagecoach is being surrounded by the Indians, and you see that the Indians are about to overwhelm them, and somebody says, well, remember to save the last bullet for yourself? Gee, what do you think that was? You know, nobody batted an eyelash at that. That was, you might say, universally approved euthanasia. Completely unethical. I don't know, I mean, just because John Wayne or Gary Cooper suggested doing this in 1940, that doesn't absolutely guarantee that that's what people did back in 1850 or 1800. And again,
in the face of torture, like I think during the war, didn't our soldiers or somebody carry something so that they could avoid torture? Now that is also forbidden?
Of course. It's a direct taking of your own life. Even if...
There's no double effect there?
Yeah, there's double effect. But you got to apply it right. You can't use an illicit means, an intrinsically immoral act, to attain a good end. You just turned into a utilitarian on us. And that applies even to spies and others who are given orders that they are to kill themselves so that under torture they would not surrender secrets. Double effect still does not apply in that case. So they're directly killing themselves. No, kamikaze is not the same. Kamikaze, the presumption of the kamikaze pilot, and I don't know what he's got in his mind. If he's saying, I'm going to finish myself off, okay, that's not acceptable. But if the idea is, I'm trying to sink an American carrier by diving into it, I will that the carrier sink, I permit the fact to know that I'm going to get killed in the process, but I don't will it. The idea of euthanasia is that you're willing the death of the person, and that the act that is performed is understood as primarily entailing killing the person or killing yourself. See, I know it gets very tricky, because then you ask, well, what is the act and what is the effect of the act? If you're taking the suicide pill, you are killing yourself in order that you not talk, or in order that you not suffer torture.
Or that you protect the lives of somebody else.
That's fine, but that's still an in order. That's a result of the act. The act is, I'm killing myself so that A, B, and C doesn't happen. Whereas the kamikaze pilot is, I'm destroying this carrier, and in the process I get killed. It's not the same.
The bad effect has to follow the good effects.
No, the bad effect and the good effect can be simultaneous, but they're both effects.
Right.
So, and there has to be a due proportion between them. But you have the act itself, and then you have the effects that flow from it. But you can't have an evil act and then go anywhere from it.
Right.
No matter what effect you produce, if the act is evil, that's the end of the game. And if you're deliberately killing yourself or another, that's the end of the game. The effects that are produced do not justify that act. The good effect does not justify the evil means.
Suppose the kamikaze pilot thought he was going to get 7 Yusha girls in the end.
Well, that's fine, provided he's only permitting himself. That's kind of a mixture of Islam with Nippon. Again, I mean, if he thinks he's going to be rewarded for what he does, I think they probably did in the afterlife. But that doesn't mean they're willing that they die. It's that they are accepting their honorable death in committing an act which is in defense of the homeland. Any other?
So the man that jumps on the live grenade to save his company.
Yeah, that's an easy one. He doesn't want to get blown apart, does he?
Well, he knows that's going to be the reality.
Of course.
There's no other way around it.
Of course, he knows that will
So
happen.
He willfully does it, right?
No, he willfully protects his comrades by jumping on the grenade. He willfully is containing the blast so it doesn't kill them. He's not willfully asking that he be blown to pieces. And if you ask him, I'm sure he would have preferred other circumstances.
All in your will.
It's not all in the will. It's in the object of the will. It's the actual act that I'm performing as I understand it in performing it. Am I actually trying to kill myself? The kamikaze pilot is not actually trying to kill himself. He's trying to sink the carrier. The guy jumping on the grenade is trying to protect his comrades.
But the calculation he's making in his mind is in essence a utilitarian, because he's saying, I'm prepared to lose my life to save.
That's not the utilitarian one. The utilitarian one is I'm prepared to take my life for my comrades. The natural law one is I'm prepared to lose my life for my comrades. It's a difference between what I will and what I permit. I didn't know we'd get such rich examples coming here, but that's always good. That's always good because it revisits double effect, doesn't it? That's why I said back when we were doing double effect, if you don't understand double effect, you're going to have a terrible time in ethics. Nothing works without it. You have to understand how to apply it. Now, that doesn't mean, when somebody sees a grenade suddenly on the ground, it doesn't mean they go out and get Higgins and start reading through it. You don't have time. But what they undoubtedly instantaneously are thinking, I've got to protect my friends. And I see by doing this, I will protect them. They're not thinking of, gee, I'd like to get killed for my friends. And if you put it that way, many people would say, gee, I'm not so sure.
I thought he was saying to his friend, you do it. You protect us.
You got 7 seconds. Okay, so coming back to death, and we can stay here. This, it takes a long time sometimes, both the treatment of subject matter and the dying. We need not prolong death. That's the point. You don't have to make somebody extend their agony unduly. You're not obligated, and that's the idea that, today you hear, we have all this money and experimental drugs and surgery and capability of keeping them going. And we just have to keep them going absolutely no matter whether they like it or not. As long as we can keep that heart beating, that's all that matters. And as long as the insurance pays for it, here we go. No, that's wrong. Death is a part of life. And we're not obliged to prolong it. You've got to make clear in your mind the distinction between terminating the life, actively terminating it, killing the person, homicide, and letting, on the other hand, nature take its course in as kindly a way as you can. They're radically distinct. We must use the normal means to prolong life. Notice, you've got it. You're obliged to prolong life. You're not obliged to prolong death. You're not obliged to prolong the dying process, but you are obliged to try to keep the person alive. Why? Because you have that initial obligation, remember, in the first place. That's why you can't commit suicide. We have an obligation to live. So, while we don't need to prolong death, we still have to use the normal means to stay alive that we were obliged to follow throughout our entire life anyway. Even when someone has what is said to be a terminal illness, we still need to use the ordinary means of staying alive. We all are terminally ill, aren't we? The day we're born, the day we're conceived, we're terminally ill. Every man is mortal. As far as I know, there's a group out there called Life Extension. Puts out a very nice journal on nutritional supplements and does a lot of research. But one of their people, or one of their goals, is to figure out how to keep us living permanently, how to keep us from ever dying. At the present time, they advocate things like cryogenics, so that when you die, you can be frozen for a while, and then you come back, then they'll resuscitate you when they've developed the means to fix whatever it was that killed you. Okay, if you want to try that one, go with my blessing. But you won't have God's blessing, I suspect. But the one of their researchers has come up with the idea that, and many of them are arguing that within the next 100 years, 200 years, we will find the way, with all of our stem cell and gene therapy and everything, we'll find the way to keep us naturally immortal. And then a question arises, okay, we're going to live forever, right? Well, one of the researchers made a very important point. They said, well, then what will be the average life expectancy? I'm thinking to myself, what do you mean average life expectancy? If you're going to live forever, you're going to live forever. No, turns out the average life expectancy is about 2,000 years. You know why? It's real simple. All you got to do is go out and look at the accident statistics. You can calculate how long it will take on average before you cross in front of a bus when you shouldn't. So even after you've literally sold your soul to the devil to have natural immortality, you're still going to die, and you might die the next day because you'll step in front of the bus sooner. Somebody's going to be out there living 10,000 years, but nobody gets a ticket to eternity on this planet. And of course, if you last long enough, an asteroid will get you. So yes, we all are going to die, but the principles we have to follow are these we delineate here. We have a right, for example, to refuse medication for pain, but we don't have the right to refuse drugs that would prolong life. Now, again, remember, we're talking about drugs that entail an ordinary means. Drugs, for example, that you can afford. We live in an age and a time, of course, when we think, well, insurance will pay for everything, and of course then we find out insurance won't pay for everything, do we? Or the government will pay for everything, and then when the government pays for everything, we suddenly find things aren't getting paid for that got paid for before, when everything wasn't going to be paid for. But where were we going here? Oh yeah, the drugs. You don't have to use every drug. If a drug entails terrible side effects, you're not obliged to use it. Again, it's a matter of ordinary versus extraordinary means. That will cover every case. Same thing with surgery. You can refuse surgery if you want, but if it's a very minor thing, if somebody's just fixing your little finger or something, you really would be hard-pressed to say you've got a good reason not to do that, except for the fact that you don't need your little finger to live, do you? So you're not obliged to fix that. You may choose to. I would. But not everybody needs to. Choice, voluntarism, is not the measure of morality. This goes back to the positivists, the positivist basis for morality. The idea that you just make up by your own will what you want. And you see the example there. Billy cannot choose to rape Sally. You can't choose to do just anything you please. The measurement of what you choose is the moral law in terms of what you're permitted to choose. We have to make a prudential judgment in each case using principles. We are permitted to use medication, let's say pain-relieving medication, even if it is possible that it may shorten life. Because again, it's a matter of double effect, where you're evaluating the two effects of the act. You're taking the medication to relieve pain. There is a possibility it may shorten life, but you don't intend that. See, sometimes people get very confused about this. But you can't take the morphine drip with the intent to shorten life. See, it's the difference between when they set up a morphine drip on somebody who's dying of, say, cancer. It's set up at a level at which it will relieve the pain but not kill you. Unfortunately, many people learn how to run those little dials. And sometimes well-meaning relatives will say, gee, you know, Fred looks like he's suffering a lot, I'll help him. And I don't know how they safeguard the amount of drip, because I suppose a nurse has to be able to adjust it easily, and that raises a near occasion of homicide, unfortunately. But we certainly are not obliged to suffer pain unnecessarily. This is a very sticky wicket. I'll tell you honestly, the real problem arises, what happens when you're certain that the pain-relieving medication will hasten death? You're not willing it, but you know that it will hasten it. Remember, applying the principle of double effect, the real hitch on this one is due proportion, isn't it? The act itself of applying a opioid, morphine, something like that, to relieve pain, that's perfectly licit. It has two effects. One, it relieves the pain, and that may be critical to the person's mental and spiritual well-being, so that they not despair, for example. The other effect is that it, in the case of some of these opioids, it will suppress respiration. It may suppress respiration. It might do it to the point of causing the person to stop breathing. Now, you know that right here you're into another one of those cases where the medical knowledge is relevant, because while this has been something people have feared, in most cases it doesn't appear to depress respiration to that extent. In other words, it may not kill you after all, even if you intended it. And if that's the case, then it's obviously perfectly legitimate to use it. So part of this is a medical judgment, a prudential judgment, about what the effect of this particular pain-relieving medication is. And the ones that are most commonly used apparently do not generally terminate life. The difficulty is, you can't say they absolutely won't. If you are unsure whether they do or not, you can use probabilism, because you could argue it either way. Remember, you're talking about due proportion. Any drug you take can kill you. That's the other thing you've got to remember. An aspirin can kill you if you have an allergic reaction to it. So if you're going to take the position that you can't use anything that might hasten death, then you better stop taking all ordinary medications. See, that's why we were talking about probabilism in a prior week. That leads to absurd conclusions. No, what you have to do is to determine the likelihood of this causing death. And if it is something that is not at all clear that it's going to do it, you can balance the risk versus the reward in such a way as to say it's licit to do it. In fact, the literature I've seen indicates that it's not that likely that it's going to kill the person. Then we have the further question, well, what about not the medicine, not the biology, what about the moral principle? Let us assume that we are morally certain it will hasten death. What then is the morality? Now, I confess, I'm not absolutely sure. First thing I would point out, though, is you're not that likely to run into such a case. Now, you'd be interested to know, I actually asked Dr. Waters about this when he was with us. And he said that even if you know that it will shorten life, it is still licit. I confess I didn't press him any further on details, given the proximity of his own demise. So unfortunately, I can give you the answer, but I can't give you the reasons. From what I've observed of the principles that I've seen enunciated with respect to the Catholic bishops on this question, it looks to me like they say the same thing. The difficulty I have is that if you are looking at the means here in relationship to the end, you do need a due proportion between the two effects produced. And the two effects are, one, the relief of pain, and let's assume you've got every reason on God's earth to do it. Two, the certain knowledge, or morally certain knowledge, because that's all you're ever going to get, that it will hasten death. Now, in order to be licit, those two effects must either be equal, or the relief of pain must be more important than the hastening of death. Ordinarily, we would tend to think that anything that actually kills you is more serious than something that causes pain. But all I can tell you at this moment is that it seems that the best ethicians and moral theologians dealing with this come down on the side of the dignity of the human person, perhaps the alleviation of pain in circumstances that might otherwise say cause despair or cause, therefore, the spiritual loss, which would result in the loss of the human soul, that may be viewed as being equal to or greater than the fact that it hastens death.
What about the opposite, where can a loved one withhold medication from someone who's in extreme pain in the case of someone who is about to reconcile with their family or with their God, to give them time? The priest is on his way, he'll be in another couple hours, and he's in excruciating pain.
I think the unfortunate but clear answer is yes, you could withhold the medication, because the good of the soul far exceeds the beneficence of your death. But I haven't completely answered the question that I posed to you, and I'm not prepared to do so tonight. Perhaps at our next class I'll be in a better position to do it. I just want you to see the alternatives that are entailed there, and not forget at the same time that it is highly unlikely that you will entail such a circumstance. That in most circumstances, it's perfectly legitimate to administer the pain medication, as long as what you're trying to do is to alleviate the pain, not to hasten death. There is no doubt that if you want to, you can turn that morphine up to the point that you'll kill the person. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a medical judgment wherein you know this amount is sufficient to hasten death, but at the same time, it's really, really needed for the person's tranquility of spirit and so forth.
Well, I don't know, Kevorkian comes to my mind when we talk like that.
Kevorkian is doing, that's why you got to distinguish very carefully. Kevorkian is saying turn it all the way up.
To kill them.
Yeah,
Well,
to kill.
There's a lot of compassion and for one.
You've got to
But
make,
experience
you've got to
is-
distinguish between what you will and what you permit. Kevorkian's acts, if I'm giving the pain medication with the intent of killing, it's homicide, plain and simple. We're talking about an extremely unusual case in which the amount of medication required to attenuate the pain is such that we know that it will shorten life. The prevailing opinion appears to be that even that is legitimate, but in no way should you confuse that with a deliberate intent to give the medication as a homicidal preparation.
Well, he made a suicide machine.
Yes, with which they gave it to themselves, but the intent always was, I'm going to kill myself.
Morphine and a lot of painkillers, from what I understand, are suicide machines. They elevate, they give it relief for a
If-
very short period of time.
Okay, again, there's no problem with that. If your intent is to use something that is intended, and you know that its primary effect is to kill, sure, it may relieve pain on the way of killing the person, but what you're doing is killing them. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's 100% different. It's difference between night and day of giving them something that is a measured amount that you know will likely hasten death, and you're certain it will hasten death, but that's not what you're trying to do. You're just trying to relieve the pain. Very different to say, what I'm doing is relieving pain, and what I'm doing is I'm putting them out of their misery. It's all the difference in the world is between night and day. In one case, all that I'm trying to do is relieve pain. In the other case, all I'm trying to do is to terminate their life. There's no confusion about those. The difficulty is when you walk the line closely on some of these issues, it's easy for people to misunderstand it. And as I said, I'm not trying to give you a definitive answer tonight.
But I just want to back up to something. Have we, in this course, have we covered a definition of ordinary means and a definition of extraordinary means so that everybody knows exactly what we mean by those terms?
I didn't give you a definition. I tried to give you a little bit of one earlier this evening.
Okay.
That's where you're talking about things that are not unusually painful, too difficult for the person to want to face. Even though it might be something others would say, sure, go ahead, cut off both my legs. Others might say, okay, so I could live that way. It's not that I'm willing that I die, but I'm just afraid of the operation. To that person, that is extraordinary means.
But also, doesn't extraordinary means also cover things like these machines that just keep you breathing artificially when you're completely, where does those type of things?
Well, if you're talking about, okay, there's a lot of issues we need to deal with here. If you're on some kind of a machine that's keeping you alive, even though if you take them off the machine, they're going to die anyway, what you're doing is prolonging life. If you reach the conclusion that there's no purpose in proceeding here, let me put it this way. The decision to put them on the machine is the same as the decision to take them off. If they're dying and the machine's not going to save their life, you're not obliged to put them on it. And if they're on the machine and they're going to die anyway and they're in the process of dying and you're just keeping heart and lungs going, you're not obliged to do that. You can pull the plug. You're not trying to kill them. You're just letting nature take its course. They're not going to recover anyway, and this is not giving them the means to recover. Now, it's another question if you think, hey, there's a remote chance if we keep them going, we can save them. That's a different circumstance. What you really always have to ask yourself is, what's the name of the game? What am I trying to do? Am I trying to kill the patient or save them? If I'm trying to kill them by whatever means, that's homicide. Real simple. If I'm trying to save them, then the question is, how much effort do I have to make? What are the circumstances that are permitted? That's what we're wrestling with. We're not wrestling with euthanasia. We're not talking about the person who has decided, like Kevorkian, that this life is not worth living, and we're going to terminate it. Or the person himself has decided it's not worth living, and he's going to end it. They know full well what they're trying to do. That's suicide or homicide, or both.
The reason I brought it up is because I remember hearing before that some modern ethicians or bioethics or whatever, someone who is terminally ill, they have redefined food and water as extraordinary means.
Oh yeah, obviously.
Which is
They call it,
which is wrong.
they call it nutrition and hydration,
Yeah.
which sounds like it's medicine. And of course, in ordinary parlance, I mean, if I stop feeding you and I stop giving you liquid, what am I doing to you? I'm killing you. Now, again, got to be a little careful here. When a person is dying, there is a point beyond which they cannot assimilate food. And you're not obligated to keep jamming it down their esophagus, keeping them in great agony, just because you say you're keeping them alive. Hydration is a different matter. From what I understand, if you do not keep a person hydrated, their internal organs start to dry up and they will suffer enormously. So any argument that you should somehow benignly stop giving them a water drip of some type is very badly misplaced, and probably is simply a hidden means of finishing them off, and in a very uncomfortable fashion. Yeah.
I'm wondering your thoughts on changes in technology, that what was very extraordinary or impossible in 1970 is ordinary today.
I said that earlier. I really did. What would be extraordinary 100 years ago is not extraordinary today.
So the obligation changes
Yes, it does.
in the future.
Yes, it does. Something today that is extraordinary in the future may be completely ordinary. And that's what gives rise to people thinking this is situation ethics. No, it isn't. The principles are constant and unvarying, but the application of them in the concrete circumstances can vary because our understanding of what's taking place changes, or the place changes, or the technology changes, or what it was that we understood was happening changes. For example, in the case of the ectopic pregnancy, until about 1940, it was thought an ectopic pregnancy you could not excise that part of the tube because it was an abortion. And then moral philosophers, theologians came to the realization that what you were doing you had a pathological condition, and that you were simply removing that portion of the tube that was diseased, and indirectly you permitted the death of the embryo in the process, and that was not immoral. So the morality didn't change, the principles didn't change, but our understanding of the nature of the act changed. And you can only act on what you understand. In a given circumstance, if I'm doing something that objectively is homicide, but I don't understand it as homicide, I can only act on what I know. And even society as a whole can only act on its understanding at a given time. Sister.
I'm just afraid you're going to end the class, and I want to go back a little bit.
Okay,
May I?
go ahead, 'cause then I'll end
Okay,
it.
It says here, to risk life to save another is not suicide. Okay?
To do what?
To risk life to save another is not suicide.
Absolutely.
Okay. Why can't I go over the falls in the barrel?
Because you're risking, first of all,
Whose life are you saving?
yeah, whose life you're going to
Kamikaze,
save?
though.
No, whose life you're going to save? Is there somebody in the rocks at the
Are you
bottom?
attacking the rocks at the bottom of the
Yes.
falls?
Is there someone down there you're going to save?
No,
Man, let's
but,
leave early.
This is what we call a foolish stunt.
well, it probably isn't that foolish, but
They don't
the
call
intent
them-
is not to kill yourself.
They don't call them daredevils for nothing.
But I don't see that it's,
Well, we can't recklessly
The-
endanger our own lives.
Yeah,
you can't,
Recklessly endanger one's own life.
Is that what you're saying?
Of course. Going over the falls in a barrel? What do you call it? You're recklessly endangering your life for fame and fortune.
Yeah.
Like the fellow here who went over, what did he do? He went over the falls once, about 1850, survived. So he did it again and survived. So then he went to some other falls in New York and said, watch me. Well, the third time was the charm.
Okay, so you're saying it's, what would?
Sister, you're not allowed to go over the falls in the barrel before our next class. I'm sorry.
Take the barrel back to where you bought it.
Okay, I can see we will have plenty of material.
Sound production copyright, Olteen Library Services, 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.